This is TWiT.
The MacBook Air. This is the latest MacBook Air with the M2 chip inside. And sure enough, today, apparently, reviews embargoes have lifted because a bunch of reviews hit the web. And there are a lot of improvements that have hit the MacBook Air M2 model. So we thought that Dan Ackerman from CNET could join us to talk all about those changes. In fact, Dan, you called this the biggest change to the airlines since its launch. Not the airlines, of course, like planes, but the MacBook Air line. So I'm excited to hear your take. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks. It's good to be here. I also have a lot of thoughts about airlines. We can certainly talk about that too.
Sure. Maybe we'll get to that later. But for right now, we're going to stick with Apple. Before getting into the review content itself, talk a little bit about like what has made the MacBook Air so unique, this family of devices in Apple's catalog of premium laptops.
It was interesting. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, I went back because it was the 10th anniversary of the MacBook Air. And I said, I got to remind myself where this line came from, where it started out. So I went back to the very first review of the first MacBook Air from 2008. I said, oh, let me read this review. Who wrote this review? It turns out it was me. I had no memory of this whatsoever. That's how long I've been doing this.
Yeah.
And that MacBook Air, even though we all loved kind of the slim shape and the idea behind it, it was $1,800. It had one USB port on it. And if you wanted a solid state hard drive instead of a platter drive, that was an extra $1,000 on top of that. Now, like that, the MacBook Air would not be something we'd hear about today. But after a few years, they said, you know what, let's just make this $1,000 laptop, $999, great for college students, people just starting out, creative people who just want to sit at a coffee shop and write a novel, or just you need a general knockaround computer. $1,000, you're sorted. You don't have to think about it. And that's why I think the MacBook Air has been so popular over the years and why I call it, for most generations, not every, but most, I call it the most universally useful computer you can buy.
Right on. And I mean, incredibly popular. I mean, I feel like you see MacBook Airs everywhere, and that's probably because of kind of the lower price category. I kind of always like steered away personally from the MacBook Air because I'm like, oh, I want performance and everything. But now we're kind of getting into this weird territory where Apple's, putting its best chips in all of its laptops. So, the differences between them are a lot more narrowed, let's say. Tell us a little bit about the configuration that you tested specifically.
Now, it's interesting because this moves from Apple's M1 chip, which was its first post-Intel chip, to the M2. And you go, oh, so M1 is the first version, M2, much better. It's actually a little more complicated than that. In the middle, they had the M1 Pro and the M1 Max and the M1 Ultra that went in different MacBook Pro and Mac Studio systems. So the M2 is actually only the second one in the lineup. It's the M1 is down here, M2, and then M1 Pro, Max, Ultra. So the naming stuff is a little confusing, as it often is. That said, M2 is a little bit faster than M1. M1 was a good deal faster than the Intel version it replaced, and all of them are fine for everyday computer stuff. I do Photoshop stuff on M1s and M2s. I've done 4K video editing on them. Generally, unless you're going like super high end or you're a real creative professional, then you should look at something with an M1 Pro or Max chip, which will take you into the MacBook Pro line. But I've said, going back many years, that people often, maybe not you, Jason, because you're a high-end professional, but a lot of people, literally, they buy too much computer. You don't need it. What are you, surfing the web, email?
Yeah.
Even Photoshop is going web-based now. And I tried out the web-based Photoshop. It's great.
Yeah. No, and thank you for calling me a professional. I do appreciate it. Your colleague, Lori Grunin, compared the M2 to the previous M1 series, kind of what you're talking about. Based on what Lori spelled out in her piece, kind of comparing the performance here, I think what I'm interested here in is kind of touches on what she wrote and also what you're talking about here, which is that, in the past, I feel like the MacBook Air hasn't been maybe the right choice for someone who's even doing basic kind of media editing and stuff like that. Like, yeah, it could work, but you'd really be better served kind of bumping up. But now with these new chips and the performance increases that we're seeing in the M1 and the M2 chips, and specifically here, obviously the M2, like, do you think this is a solution for like your basic YouTuber or something like that?
And these numbers you're seeing are all based on the labs testing we're doing at the CNET labs, because we still do all our own benchmarking, super important to us. And yeah, what we've established is if you're looking at 13-inch laptops, the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, the 13-inch Pro, the difference delta between them in terms of performance is very, very small. They actually both use the M2 chip now. And if you're going beyond a certain number of streams of, 4K or 8K video, sure, then you want to trade up. And the delta between the M2 and the M1, even Pro, the next step up, is pretty big, but so is the price difference. For $1,200, you can do really well with this, and I would be very happy doing YouTube, doing basic video editing, doing even high-end photo editing. And another thing that you get now that kind of held the Air back before is you get the 500 nit, the brighter screen that the Pros have had. So now you have a better screen as well, and this one is even a little bit bigger. It's one of those little secret upgrades. It's not 13.3 inches, it's 13.6. It's not the biggest difference in the world, but to people like you and me who maybe have to turn the Google Docs up to 125% these days, every little bit helps.
Hey, what are you saying? What are you saying? I'm getting older? That's true. I am getting
I'm saying this is my, I think I'm at the trifocals now. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Otherwise, the design language has kind of changed. This is no longer wedge, is that right?
This is the first time since that 2008 launch that it's not a wedge. It's the same kind of flat, I call it a very constructivist look, free of any kind of ornamentation that the 14 and 16-inch Pros have, and the Mac Studio also. Here, look, if I lift it up like this, see, look at that, totally flat. If you put it back to back with a wedge MacBook Air, it's a little bit narrower at the back, and the footprint it's really 99.9% the same, but it feels thinner and it's a hair lighter. But I think it's much more sleek looking like this.
Yeah, that's a slick looking device. I like it. How about the higher res webcam? We were talking before the show that you're not using, obviously you were just showing us the Air, so you're obviously not using that to do your video for this interview, but you are using basically the same webcam. What was your experience with the camera on this device?
Yeah, I'm using the 1080 camera in the 24-inch iMac, which is essentially the same as a 1080 camera now in the 14-inch Pro, 16-inch Pro, and now this 13-inch Air, not in the new 13-inch Pro. That still has the old 720 camera. And listen, we all know that MacBook webcams have always kind of sucked. Everybody's always said that. And now that we're doing all these, web meetings and Zoom meetings and video stuff, it's more important now than ever. And frankly, 2 years too late, there's finally a 1080 camera in a MacBook Air. And it's not just the resolution, it's the image processing too. We did some side-by-side still shots and video, and you can see those on our CNET review, and you can really tell the difference. And again, not just resolution, the image processing is much smarter behind it, and is really caught up with a lot of Windows systems where premium Windows systems have moved to 1080 cameras over the last few years.
Right on. And then also want to talk a little bit about MagSafe, because personally, I've always been a big fan of MagSafe. I was definitely bummed when they got rid of it. And then it's come back. And I very recently, like within the last month, bought the MacBook Pro, last year's model of the MacBook Pro that does have the MagSafe, has the M1 chip. And I really appreciate having MagSafe back. You mentioned in your article that you're kind of like, you know what, I think I'm over it. Like the USB-C is just fine. Tell us a little bit about that, because I as much as I'm happy having MagSafe back, it's not as critical to me either, because like you say, you can just plug it right into USB-C and it's not a big deal.
You got options. I love MagSafe originally. I was sad when it went away, largely because I'm very clumsy. But then something interesting happened. Apple did something the company does not often do. It added a universal standard to its products and said, oh, USB-C, that's your data connection, your accessory connection, your power connection, and half the phones out there and almost all the Windows laptops out there and your Nintendo Switch and your Steam Deck and everything else all decided to use USB-C. I'm like, I can't believe we're living in this. Is this real? Am I living in a simulation? This is amazing. So what does Apple do immediately? They go, you know what? We're bringing back a proprietary cable. Let's do that. So they eat up a bunch of space on the side over here for the MagSafe connection. You still get USB-C and you can still use that. If you want to use this, it's a perfectly nice cable. And on the MacBook, it's color-coded. The cable matches. Like this is midnight, which I think is the coolest color. And the cable for the MagSafe is also midnight. But am I going to carry around one proprietary cable with me, or am I just going to throw a generic USB-C cable from like a Dell or something in my bag, or just assume that everywhere I go, if somebody is going to have a USB-C plug, that's what I'm going to do?
Yeah, and along those lines, kind of with the option, like now that I'm thinking about it, you know, at my home setup, I have like my music production studio, and it kind of goes into place, and I can have it plugged into MagSafe there. But then when I'm going anywhere, you're right. In my bag, I'm going to have a USB-C if I'm going to have anything, and that's just fine. Plug it into the MagSafe. Then if I knock it off the studio table, hey, whatever. But it's less of a necessity now than I feel like it. Well, then it felt like it was back in the first version of MagSafe to me. So
I mean, especially because everyone had proprietary laptop cables back then.
Totally.
Brand A didn't work with brand B. Now it's so universal. And even Apple was on board for a while. And I was pleasantly surprised by that until they said, oh, wait, we can sell you a special cable again. Why are we not doing that?
Well, at least you have options. At least you have both of them. And then price-wise, entry cost for this laptop is definitely up. How do you feel about how does that sit with you?
This is my biggest disappointment about the system. They brought back what I call my least favorite feature about the MacBook Air, the feature being they occasionally make it more expensive than $999. I think back in maybe 2018, they bumped it up by $200, and I said, that's a terrible idea. And then a year or two later, they brought it back down to $999, where it stayed ever since. So now we're back up to $1,200. As a SOP, they're keeping the M1 version, the wedge version from 2020, and you're buying 2020 hardware if you're doing this. They're keeping that at $999, so Apple can say we sell a $1,000 computer, but you're going to feel kind of left out if you get that MacBook Air and then somebody else next to you has this MacBook Air with the new screen and the new camera and the new features and the M2 chip instead of the M1 chip.
Colors, yeah.
I feel like, hopefully in a year or two, this one will go back down to $999. I think it's an important psychological barrier and frankly, a practical barrier. If you're a college student, if you're just starting out, if you're just going to sit in a coffee shop and write your novel all day, $999 is achievable. You can work your way up to that. $1,200, then you gotta reconsider.
I absolutely agree. I think a psychological barrier, that's exactly what it is. And I have to imagine at some point that ends up dropping down again. So, but that's just a guess, and we will see. And when that happens, perhaps Dan Ackerman will write all about it like he has this awesome review at CNET. Dan, it's always a pleasure getting to talk with you. Thank you for hopping on with us. If people want to follow your work online, where can they find you?
You can find me all over CNET and on Twitter at Dan Ackerman. Thanks, man.
Right on. Thank you, too. Take care of yourself. Be safe and stay healthy this summer. We'll talk to you soon.
Will do. See ya.
Bye, Dan.